Hello everybody and welcome to part 5 of this tutorial series. A quick reminder before we dive in, if you are looking for any of the code for this series, you can find that from the link in the description. I apologize, but I don't have separated code for videos 1 through 4. That's just my mistake. I forgot to do that. So I have all of that code in one folder. You can kind of sift through it and look through the files, and you'll be able to find what you need. But for this video and all the videos going forward, I will upload the code separately, so nothing to worry about that. So in this video, what we're going to be doing is working a little bit on the back end. We're going to be writing a view that will allow us to actually create a new room by simply sending a post request to the endpoint that we set up. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about how this works because this is very important. And I do apologize if we're only going to write, say, 20 lines of code in this video, but I'm really trying to make sure that you understand this, because if you want to write API views that are different from the ones that I have, well, you have to have the knowledge to be able to do that. And so I'm going to spend the time to explain it. But anyways, that I guess was pretty much it for the introduction. Let's go ahead and get started, and let's start making that view that can create a room for us. So right now I'm inside of my API folder. I am in the views.py folder, views.py file inside of the API folder. And the first thing that I'm going to do inside of here is just import a few things that we're going to need to write this view. So we're going to go ahead and say from REST_framework, not JWT, .views import API view. This is a generic API view that I'll show you how we use in a second. We're also going to say from REST_framework dot, and I believe this one is response. We're going to import response. This is so we can send a custom response from our view. And then from where we have from REST framework import generics, we're also going to import status. What this will do is give us access to HTTP status codes, which we are going to need to use when we return our custom response. Other than that, I think that's it for imports in this file. And actually, what I'm going to do first is go make another serializer that we're going to use in this view. So let's go over to our serializers file here. And I'm going to define another serializer, and this one is going to be a create room serializer. Now, the idea behind this is that we are going to send what's known as a post request to the endpoint that we set up here. So we'll make a view inside of here that will handle a post request. And the post request, if you're not aware, is typically when we're creating something new, we send that type of request, and we send a payload that has information in it. So I'll send a post request to say like /create-room. And then what's hidden in this request, what you wouldn't see, say, in the URL if you were typing this in, is the payload that will have the information in the post request. So we'll have a payload that has something like votes to skip, and that will be equal to 3. And then we'll have another payload that says, guest can pause, and that will be equal to true or false. So we want this serializer here to pretty much make sure that the data that's being sent in our post request is valid and that it fits or kind of corresponds with the correct fields that we need to create a new room. So we're going to say class meta. We're going to say model equals room. And then here we're going to say fields equals, and inside of fields, we're going to put the fields that we want to be sent as part of the post request. So unlike here, where what this is meant to do is take a room object and serialize it into something that we can return back to the as a response, essentially. This is looking to actually serialize a request. So it's going to take the data from the request and make sure that that's all valid, and then give it to us in kind of a Python format that we can work with. So instead of putting all of the fields, we just put the fields that we want to be sent in the post request. So we're going to say guest can _pause and votes _to _skip. So again, that will just make sure that when we pass in data to this serializer, that we have both of these fields and that these fields correspond with the ones on the room model. So whenever you're handling different requests, it's usually a good idea to use a serializer, either an incoming serializer to handle the request or an outgoing one to handle the response, depending on what you're sending. All right, so now that we have the serializer, let's go back to the views, and from our serializers, let's import the create room serializer. Now let's make another class. Let's call this create room view. And then inside of here, we're going to put API view as our base class. What API view allows us to do is override some default methods. So we can define, say, a get method, we can define a post method, we can define a put method. And that means when we send that type of request to this API view, it will automatically dispatch it to the correct method. So we will continue in just one second, but I need to take a quick pause to thank the sponsor of this video and this series, which is AlgoExpert. AlgoExpert is a coding interview prep platform, and it's what I used when I was preparing for my interviews. Now, AlgoExpert is great. I use it all of the time to freshen up my programming skills and maybe even learn a new programming language, as there is 11 different languages that you can write in on the platform. And I would highly recommend it to anyone just looking to get better at programming problems or preparing for their next coding interview. You can check it out from the link in the description and use the discount code TechWithTim for a discount on the platform. So let's go ahead and continue, and I want to write now the method, which is a post method. So I'm going to define post, I'm going to put self, I'm going to put request, and I'm going to put an optional format that by default will be equal to none. Now I'm just going to put pass inside of there so this damn server down here stops getting mad at me, and I'm going to define what is known as the serializer class inside of this create room API as a, I guess, class variable or whatever you would call it. So I'm going to say serializer class equals, and instead of room serializer, we're going to use create room serializer. Now this is unnecessary. I don't need to do this, but I'm going to just because it kind of makes more sense if we were going to have a lot more methods in this class, and well, you'll see why in a second. So before we dive into this, I actually just want to go back to models.py here and review what we need for a room model. So first of all, there's a little mistake here that I just noticed. Notice how this default says blank. The default for code should not say blank. It should be equal to generate unique code, the function that we defined and that I guess I never used. So instead of having the default be that blank string, make it generate unique code without the brackets. That's important. What that means is whenever we create a new room, we will by default call this function, which will give us a unique code. So that's what we do there. Very important that you don't add the brackets there and that you just leave it like that. All right, so now that we have that, let's just quickly discuss the fields and kind of attributes of room. So we have a code, we have a host, we have a guest can pause, a votes to skip, and created at. Now, realistically, when we send this post request, as I already showed us in the serializer, the only information we need is guest can pause and votes to skip. Now, some of you may be asking, well, don't I need this host piece of information? Yeah, I get the code's automatically generated, created at, that's automatically generated. But what about host? Well, the front end or whoever's sending us this request isn't really going to know how to identify who the host is, and hence it doesn't really make sense for them to send us the host. The way in which we're actually going to pick how we store the host or figure out who the host is by using something called a session key. So this leads me to sessions, which I need to discuss, and that's kind of why I went back to room here. But whenever we connect to a website, what happens is we establish what's known as a session. Now, a session is really just a temporary connection between two computers or between two devices. That's the best way to think about it. And a way that a session works, so the best example of a session is something like you heading to Facebook or Instagram or a page that you frequently visit and that you would usually have to sign into, but since you're on the same device that you always use, you don't have to. So when you go to Facebook and you've been there yesterday, you were there the day before, you signed in some point recently, it doesn't ask you to sign in again. The reason it doesn't ask you to do that is because you are on the same session that you were previously. So it knows that, hey, the person who was in this session already authenticated, they already signed in, and hence I don't need to sign them in again. If that was not the case, then every single time you went to a different URL on Facebook, you would have to sign in again and again and again and again, and obviously that's not good. But the way that sessions are identified is by a unique key. So it does have to do with your IP address and your location in the world and all of that stuff, but you can kind of just think of a session as having a unique identity. And well, your web browser, establishes a session with this website and it remembers you, quote unquote, for a temporary period of time. Now, this session is typically stored in memory, at least in our Django app, it's going to be stored in memory. So in system RAM, essentially, which means if we stop running this app or the server goes down or our computer crashes or whatever, then we'll lose that session data. Now that's fine. We don't really care to permanently identify users. We just need to know relatively which user is which and if they're currently hosting a room or if they're not, so that we can kind of figure that out. So this will make more sense as we get through it, but just know that we're going to store users and kind of identify users based on their session, and each user will have a unique session. Even two users on the same network, for example, would have a unique session. So the first thing we need to do inside of our post request is we need to get access to the session ID. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to say if not self.request.session.exists, and then inside of here, we're going to say self.request.session.session key. And come on, give me session underscore key. I could spell session correctly. Okay, there we go, session key. So we're just first checking if the current request or if the current user has an active session with our web server. If it doesn't, then what we're going to do is have to create that session. So we'll say self.request.session.create. So if they do not have a session, create one. If they already do have a session, that's fine. We can just skip through and go to the next step. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to use our serializer. So I'm going to say serializer equals self.serializer class. And the data I'm going to give to the serializer is going to be my request.data. Now, like I said, what this will do is take all of our data and it will serialize it and give us some Python representation of it. And we'll be able to check essentially if the data sent was valid. So what we can do is say if serializer.isValid, and that will pretty much just tell us if the two fields that we define, guess can pause and votes to skip, are valid and are in the data that was sent as part of our post request. So if that's true, we know that that's all good. And well, we can go ahead and create a room. So inside of here, I'm going to get that data. I'm going to say guest can underscore pause is equal to serializer, not dot is valid, but dot data dot, and you guessed it, guest underscore can underscore pause. Now we're going to do the same thing here with votes. So we're going to say votes underscore to underscore skip equals serializer dot data dot, and then we will say votes underscore to underscore skip because we know that's going to be in there and we know that's valid based on the fact that the serializer was valid. And then we need the host. So we'll say the host is equal to, and you guessed it, self.request.session.session key. All right, so now that we have that, we have the three pieces of information that we need to create a new room, but we need to think carefully about if we should just go ahead and create this. Because there is a possibility that the person trying to create a new room already has an active room. In that case, I don't want to make a new room for them. What I will do instead is update their room settings so that their guest can pause and votes to skip are equal to whatever request it is that they just sent us. So this means we will give them the same room code and we will return them to kind of the original room that they were in, but it will just have the updated settings that they sent us. This makes sense. And just thinking about this to explain quickly, say a user had multiple sessions or their session expired and then they restart another session for some reason, that would be fine. We would just create a new room for them. Their old room would just be lost in the database and all would be good. That would be totally fine because their session key would have changed and no one's session key will be equal to the same session key that already existed before. So hopefully that makes sense, but I just wanted to explain that. So the first thing I'm going to do is say query set equals and then room.objects.filter, and I'm going to look to see if there's any rooms in our database that have the same host that's trying to create a room right now. So I'll say if query set dot, not execute, but dot exists, then what we'll go ahead and do is simply grab the active room, so the one that the host already owns, and we'll just update its settings. So we'll say room equals query set 0, and then room dot guest can pause is equal to guest can pause, room.votes to skip is equal to votes to skip. And then finally, all we have to do is simply update the room. So we'll say room.save. And since we're updating fields here and we're not creating a new room, we need to actually pass a parameter to this that says update underscore fields and a list of the fields that we want to force this to update with. So we're going to say guest can pause is a field that we want to be updated. And we also want votes to skip to be updated as well. So whenever you're updating an object and you're using this method of resaving it, you need to pass the update fields with any of the fields that you do want to update. You of course can omit some if you want, but yeah, that's the basic way that it works. Now that's the case if we're updating the room. If we're not updating the room, then we're creating a new one. So in that case, we can say room equals room like that. And then inside of here, we can say the host equals host, because we already have that variable. We can say guest can pause is equal to guest can pause, and we can say votes to skip is equal to votes to skip. Then here we can simply say room.save, and well, we would have saved this room, and this is all good. Now, technically, that creates the room, but we still want to return a response to tell whoever sent this to us whether this was valid or whether it was not. So what we will do is we'll go ahead and we will return a response that we already imported from above. And this response will actually contain the room. So we will send them back the exact room that they just created with the extra information like the ID, the code, and the time that it was created at. So to do that, we need to serialize this room object that we just updated or that we just created. So what we're going to do is use the room serializer, which remember we used up here in this room view and that we have imported. And we're going to pass as the data to this, or sorry, not the data, but just we're going to pass the room to this. And then we're going to say .data. Now .data will give us a JSON formatted data, or I guess just give us JSON formatted data. And then we can send that back as well as a status code to say if everything was okay. So we're going to say status equals, and then that's going to be equal to status, which again, we imported from above. And I think there's something like 202 for created. Or 204 for created. There's something that represents created. I'm going to try to find it and then I will show you what the code is. I guess method right here, and put the string representation of the field that we want. So just change these lines here to look like this. So line 26 and line 27. Again, you can find the code on GitHub in case you were confused on what this is. But yeah, guess can pause, votes to skip. And then I had just refreshed to make sure this was working, obviously, and it's all good. You can see that it created a room for us, ID 2. This is the code. This is the host. So this is technically our session ID. Guess can pause is true, votes to skip 4, created at blah, blah, blah. So now we see that we have this create room thing active, right? It's showing post. Let's just change it and let's send a 5 and let's see what happens. So post, and there we go. Now votes to skip gets updated to 5. And if we go ahead and just refresh, or I don't want to refresh that page, but I go back to create room. Now let's just try to create another room. So let's say, no, you can't pause. Let's make the votes 999 just so that it's clear if there's a change. And then we'll post, and notice that we have the same host that we had before. The created at actually did not change. We might want to change that. It might be a good idea to change that. And then 999 and false. All right. And then it says to us HTTP 200 OK, which is the response we get back if this is OK. So on that note, I think I'm actually going to end the video here. In the next video, we will hook this up with the front end and we will make it so we have a nice graphical user interface, a nice form, and that is actually what ends up creating the room. So anyways, with that, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and of course, I will see you again in another YouTube video.